Professor Wang, most Australians don't have a strong understanding of the Singapore-Malaysian region. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the contemporary issues and the history behind where these issues come from?
To begin with, there was nothing in the history of that part of the world to have prepared for countries like Malaysia or Singapore. They were all a number of Malay kingdoms, ports, and so on, for part of little empires, business empires. And it was really the Europeans who drew up the borders. It was between the Dutch and the English who drew up the borders that separated Indonesia from Malaysia and cut off the Malay world. And then the Spanish drew the other side of the border. And that's what we have today. At one time, they were just borderless, and people moved back and forth. If it were possible for them to relive all that, they're probably quite content. But since these borders have now been drawn, then who draws them, how they're drawn, and how you live with those borders, and how the people who are living within those borders cope with the fact that there are now borders. That, I think, has been the great test of the last few decades. All these people, whether Indonesians, Malaysians, Singaporeans, have had to accept the borders. And what do we do now? How do we make ourselves into a country, a nation, who actually share the values of this new nation? And what were our expectations of it? So the tough decisions were made in the 1960s. And there were some very tough decisions, and lots of people were hurt, there's no question about it. Not everybody was comfortable. But today, when the young generation look back, I think most of them don't even know that was what it was like. And those who take it for granted today wonder what was the fuss about, it's so easy. Well, it wasn't easy. And what I was trying to say in recalling what I lived through was what the alternatives were. There were so many ways they could have gone. But a number of things were put on the table. The British had one, the Indonesians had one, the communist parties of the region had others. So these were sorted out, if you can put it that way. And the sorting out was fighting in the jungle, sorting out on the table, bargaining between different powers that be. Most importantly, of course, the British, because they were in charge. The Dutch had already lost control of everything, so there was Indonesia. But the British knew they had to go home. There was no way they could stay on. So in order to go home, they wanted to be sure they left behind a place that they would still be friendly towards them and still look after their interests. So that's how they thought of Malaysia. And they wanted Malaysia to take over all the British territories in that archipelagic world, peninsula and the islands, whatever was there left. So that was their plan. And on the face of it, it failed completely because Singapore just couldn't fit in and was kicked out. But as I'm trying to say, really 50 years back, looking back at it now, the little failure actually became a great success. And unintended probably, unexpected certainly, but the leadership that took over, in order to survive, had to live on their wits and find ways and means of building up their own power base and making it possible for these countries to survive and ultimately thrive.
Your presentation indicated a newfound confidence in the Southeast Asian region. Do you think this is a result of the flipping of economic powers from, say, Europe and America towards that part of the world?
I think that is an accurate decision, accurate description. They have found reason to be confident because, on the whole, the economies of Asia have done very well. It started with Japan and then the Four Tigers. And beyond anyone's expectation that the Chinese should turn around and develop the way they have done by opening their doors and engaging with the market economy outside, bringing in the kind of foreign investments which have been so successful for China. And today they have created a market which is extraordinary, unbelievably big, and that very quickly too. Now that has given great deal of confidence. It now means that the whole of East Asia is an integrated economic superpower. Not China alone, but the whole of East Asia. And Southeast Asia, on the edge of it, has benefited all along from Japan, from Korea and others, from the Four Tigers, and now have added support from China. And not only that, now with India coming up as well, offering, as it were, an Indian perspective on the whole thing. And all that time, Australia and New Zealand was backing them for Southeast Asia. So when you now look at the whole picture, with East Asia, Oceania, South Asia, increasingly coming together, but if they succeed in coming together, Southeast Asia is right in the middle. It will be the greatest beneficiary of all those developments. So I think the leaders there feel that this is a fantastic opportunity, something that I would say nobody expected to be quite like that. And with the fact that the Americans and Europeans now in financial trouble, and the fact that Asia is not quite in that position, but much better off, that of course has added to their sense of destiny, so to speak.
Yeah, it's almost like there's been a flipping around, of the current power state or the power status.
Well, that's putting it looking too far ahead. It may or may not happen. It may not, but at least the potential of a real change, a shift, certainly in the balance of economic relationships. I think that is definitely happening, and that will go on. But power, political relationships are still a different matter. Military, political relations, but economic relations, I think that shift has already occurred, and that I think has been giving the people in Southeast Asia a much better sense of themselves.
With the rise of both China and India and the sort of sucking back of power of the United States, do you think the Southeast Asian region is invariably leading to conflict, or do you think there's a space for cooperation?
Actually, there are many routes possible for them to take, and I think the leaders of all these three countries you mentioned, and others as well, are weighing all this very, very carefully. And there are so many variables that it's impossible to predict exactly what will happen, because something can always go wrong. But if you look at what the leaders really want, they all want peace and security in the area. Nobody wants war. Nobody wants to fight over everything. What I think everybody wants is economic development that benefits everybody, number one. Number two, the benefits that flow from that will create stability in society, and a stable society would ensure better politics. Political leaders would have the backing and legitimacy and credibility to negotiate better. And when they're more secure, political relations improve because the leaders are themselves secure. I think all that is actually basically agreed. All of them agree on that. They don't want anything other than that. The really tricky parts are simply to know who will push who out in some areas. Because if you grow economically and somebody else doesn't grow as much, there will be gives and take. And the giving and the taking part is where you need real understanding. If somebody feels that you're taking too much and you're asking me to give up too much and doesn't accept that, then the economic relations becomes even more difficult. So I think that's where the politics comes in. The politics, no political leader can afford to be seen by his people to have given in on political issues. And economic issues reflect some of that, because if economically you're losing out and your economic position affects your political stance about certain things, then your credibility as a political leader in the eyes of your people becomes an issue. And this is where, of course, all the leaders face the same problem. And the idea of a status quo is quite a nice idea. But since we all know things change, how can there be status quo? Not forever. All status quo are simply the moment. Something changed, the pieces move, things change. The status quo must change accordingly. Now, how you manage that change and how you can persuade your people, your own people, to understand why the change is necessary, whether you're gaining or losing, you still have to explain that to people and what the costs are, what the consequences could be. If you fail to explain that properly, you are in big trouble. But if you succeed, and if all the leaders can succeed in retaining the confidence of their people while the status quo is shifting, there should be no problem. But the danger is leaders fail. Not because the situation is that bad. It's all actually, everybody wants the same thing, so why should it go wrong? It goes wrong because some leaders are better than others in managing their own people. And when they fail to manage their own people and are worried for their own safety because of failure in the eyes of their own people, or weakness in the eyes of their own people, then they can do stupid things. And that's the danger. That's where we can't predict.
I want to pick up on a point that your colleague, Professor Lily Kong, made this morning about in-betweenness. What do you think?
I think being in between is bound to happen. The present difficulty in predicting what will happen is simply because the proportions are wrong. The proportions of people who are comfortable in between, that is very small. Those who have already pushed beyond that and actually moved to one side and no longer are in between are also growing. And those who don't want to move at all to that position are still fairly large. And how you move these proportions to a position where the majority of people become comfortable to be in between and are confident that they can actually manage both sides, that is hard to be sure. You need a large group, maybe not absolute majority, but very sizable group of people in positions of influence and power who demonstrate that the position of in-betweenness is the best for their society and community. Then you've won the battle. But if you can't demonstrate that, and you get leakage of those who find it too difficult and decide to move out altogether, become Westerners, go and become Australians, New Zealanders, Americans, and so on, give up. And those who say, look at that, and react against it and say, well, we want to maintain our traditions. We must go back to our roots, and our traditions are above everything. And all this in-betweenness is a kind of surrender to weakness and so on. If that, which is still a very large group of people in Asia, if that group doesn't diminish and actually get stronger in their belief that this kind of leakage and surrender is not the future for Asia, then it wouldn't work. That comfortable position will not grow. Now, Singapore is moving in that direction, but most of Asia is not. They're still a long way from that. So what Singapore, or Professor Lily Kong was expressing, is the experience of Singapore to say that this is possible. This is the way of the future, and it is actually working for Singapore. We'll have, I think, a very rough time elsewhere. So we can hope, of course, that the Singapore example might encourage others. But so much depends on what I call this, the in-between group, the middle group, to cut off the leakage, or at least to diminish that, which is that the leakage is pretty high, and even in Singapore. And the other side, to persuade the others to move away from just being sick in the muds, insisting on old ways which no longer suit the modern world. How do you persuade them? They are very sizable, and some of them are pretty passionate about their traditions. And to deal with that, to manage that relationship, to make them understand that the in-between position has many advantages for everybody, I think is going to be an uphill struggle.
I want to touch on contemporary Malaysian politics for a moment. Do you think the current situation is a direct result of the failure of the Malaysian dream?
That's a very good question. I think they are having a very tough time. In fact, I think many people outside don't appreciate what a tough time they're having, trying to keep up something that they actually believe in, because it is related to the fact that the forces of Western soft power on the one hand and traditional appeal on the other remain there. And they are, in a way, trying to build a society which can somehow live with both, if that were possible. And I think that generation was still educated to believe that that would be ultimately a good ideal to have. And they, I think, have worked very hard while they were building up their political experiences, were trying to keep it going and not let it go. But it's hard because the way people are opposed to one another on the one side or the other, the two extremes as it were, are not letting go, and they're not getting much smaller. They're still up pretty strong. And the middle position, which is always difficult in any society anyway, they can hold it because they've got a powerful bureaucracy and still a loyal military to back them. And there's still enough of the secular nationalists who are still in the core of the bureaucracy and the military to go along with them. But will that group hold? And will that group also leak both ways and diminish over time? As the new generation are being educated in different kinds of schools and under different kinds of pressures, can those people pick up those ideas and keep going? It's still a question mark. And I think people like Palal and Najib, they are still holding on to their father's ideals, and they're hoping to pull it through. But when I see them struggling, it's really very tough. And unless you're tough, really tough like Mahathir, who can sit on both, but because he's tough enough and he's got all those years behind him and has enough credibility, he can actually handle both and survive. It's much harder for others who don't have his particular kind of mental toughness and political skill.